Okay, get your pitchforks ready. It's time for another bad take first impressions video. Previously, I've had Farina is not guaranteed to buff your Hu Tao and Neuvillette because of her ramping buffs, long animations, and teammate restrictions. Xilonen is niche and only really an improvement to about 3 characters. There was also this series where I thought Arlecchino was overpowered and Hu Tao wasn't a good comparison. Wait. You could say all those ended up being pretty true. Anyway, I got a lot of negative comments in those videos at the time though. So this time we've got Xilonen. Of course, Xilonen just got revealed in the official 5.1 preview livestream. She sounds great. A geo healer capable of shredding resistance for multiple elements. That sounds great for my Navia and probably other teams too. But then people in my chat and other communities started popping off. I heard she's Geo Bennett because she's a healer buffer, Geo Kazuha because of the red shred and damage buffs from the new scroll artifact set, Zhongli power creep because comparing a 1.1 character to a 5.1 character, they're going to have bigger buffs. And remember, I don't do leaks, I'm just theory crafting based on my understanding of the game so far. And honestly, I was thinking about it, and based on what info we have, I don't think she actually sounds like a Bennett, Kazuha or Xiangling type character where she will be best in slot in a ton of teams. At least that's not guaranteed. Let me cook. First of all, and this might be a bit of a nitpick, but personally I don't think Kazuha is a good comparison at all. I don't really know why people keep saying Geo Kazuha this, Geo Kazuha that. Here's the thing, there are a dozen characters good at healing, but it's only really one character good at grouping. Kazuha isn't just buffs, grouping is a massive part of his kit. I think the best comparison is more like a healing Zhongli with a less clunky artifact set, since the new scrolls set is just a lot less clunky than Tenacity of the Millilith or especially Archaic Petra. But let's get into teams. So for Navia teams, Geo Res Shred and 40% damage bonus from scrolls sounds like a massive upgrade for Navia. As a Navia speedrunner myself, that would be pretty hype if her damage per screenshot gets even crazier. But here's the thing I think many people are overlooking. Just adding those buffs is assuming a perfect scenario, but there are many things to be concerned about. First of all, Navia heavily revolves around her skill and maxing out these stacks. And maxing out these shotgun stacks requires a lot of regular crystallized reactions to be made by your team. You get a lot of multiplier buffs by hitting this max. And this is why teammates like Kachina, Xiangling, Chiori, Zhongli are very effective. The Geos have off-field Geo application, and Xiangling obviously has no ICD on a Pyrap. I don't know if you've heard about this no ICD Pyronado thing. Anyway, from how they explain Xilonen's kit, she doesn't really have this off-field Geo app. It's just her burst doing a few hits and healing. So you're going to be reliant on Navia generating enough stacks by herself, almost as if she is in a solo Geo team. You might have heard somewhere on the internet that Navia can make full stacks herself and her teammate application makes no difference, but as someone who's probably spent hundreds of hours speed running and optimizing every little thing about Navia, I wish that were true, but it really isn't. Enough yapping though, let me do a quick example of what this could look like. So this is Navia Kachina, a team with good off-field Geo application. Let's see what the stack generation looks like.
Everybody stand back. Feeling lucky? This one's got your name on it. This one's got your name on it.
Let's see what Navia Chiori stack generation looks like as well.
A proper send-up. Everybody stand back. Eat this. Feeling lucky? Coming at ya.
As you can see, I was generating a lot of application there. I'm maxing out on my stacks pretty consistently. A good way I can demonstrate no Geo app, I guess, is by using Zhongli's burst only. So let's do that. So this might be similar to how Xilonen stack generation is. Just using Zhongli's burst, and then that's all we're getting from the other Geo. So you can see at the start, we're getting some good geo up there.
This one's got your name on it.
Now I'm struggling to max that second one. And by the third shot, yeah, I'm struggling to max out the third shot as well. So these are some old calcs I had with Zhongli Navia, and then I added in an extra 40% damage for Kachina, and those rough numbers for Navia's damage are about here. So even if I'm theoretically getting a huge upgrade with Xilonen, maybe even 17 to 20% theoretical upgrade, but the benefit I get from this is rapidly deteriorating if I'm not getting full stacks. And this can get even worse if you've ever compared Zhongli versus using Farina, because you might be hyping up Xilonen as a way of getting more buffs from Farina because Xilonen is a healer, but it's a big assumption to think that things will work perfectly for these either. Farina's Hydra app is okay, but it doesn't compare to Zhongli's Pyro app. I can show you a quick example here. So imagine combining Farina and Zhongli. For the first hit it might be fine, but now I really struggled for that second hit, getting all the stacks there on the left. Now over here also struggled. Anyway, the second concern I had about Navia teams is a lot of people don't know this and overlook this, but these geo resonance buffs that are actually quite decent, they aren't actually guaranteed in every geo team. As you can see here, characters need to be protected by a shield, and you're basically only really guaranteed that with Zhongli's fat shield. And I wish crystallized shields were guaranteed perfect uptime on these, but they really aren't. I noticed it when I was first testing switching Zhongli for Chiori, and it's definitely noticeable how Navia starts getting hit and staggered more, especially versus bosses. And say for example, let's say if I simulate having less uptime on Geo-Res stuff, that's also a way Xilonen's increase can go down. And again, this is also before factoring in that Kachina can actually do okay off-field damage. I know most people haven't really built her yet. She works perfectly fine at level 20 with barely any talents, but you can build her for damage, and I actually think I can get somewhere around 150k damage per rotation, somewhere around that, because I've got her C6. I'm still working on my build, but she can be built for damage, and her damage, say if I even add 100k DPR, that's basically cancelling out, assuming that Xilonen doesn't really do much damage herself. And look, it makes sense really. They've just released Chiori and Kachina as geo off-fielders, and I think they've carefully designed Xilonen so she doesn't do this too, and so she's not just better in every way. Now lastly, but certainly not least, there's the issue of geo shield content. And the truth is, a lot of geo content in the Abyss, the enemies that they put in to advertise geo characters like Navia, and that's when a lot of people are playing Navia, they often quite put in bosses with tough geo shields. Like the Plunge Geo Local Legend I think is around here, and the Legato's Golem over here. And the thing with these is, even if other teammates are supposed to be slightly more DPS, in practice Zhongli has always been better. Why? Because his geo shield removal is just on another level compared to everyone else. Like here's my Kachina's shield break, here's Chiori's shield break. Now check this out. Look at that. And getting his shield down is going to be a big DPS increase to your team. Is very important. Let's take a look at this guy as well. See, it's just on another level. And I don't know if Xilonen will be at that level either. Zhongli's talent even specifically says that he drains a large amount of geo element from 2 targets. Anyway, overall, it's hard to tell with Navia. I don't want to be too negative. I'm like maybe 50-50 on it at the moment. Me personally, I play Navia a lot. I would love it if she gets even more cracked with a teammate buff. It would make all my Navia videos even faster, but as you can see, there's quite a lot of things to be concerned about. So one of Zhongli's most popular uses at the moment is like a Neuvillette hypercarry team. And Zhongli is good here, but he doesn't do that much theoretically. So people are freaking out about how Xilonen is obviously going to power creep this slot. and make Neuvillette even stronger than he already is. I mean, if you compare Zhongli, he has Shred, but it's only 20. And he has Archaic Petra, but it's 35% and it's very clunky compared to the support set Natlan characters can use. And in the Hydro team with Neuvillette, it's not going to be hard to activate this. But here's the first issue. Xilonen is a healer. And as we know, most people, at least if you've got a C0 Neuvillette, don't like playing him without a shielder. Getting stunned out of his charge attack is rough. Zhongli is just too comfortable to play, and Neuvillette is already strong. And people even play Baiju here, who doesn't really do that much, but he does give interrupt resistance, and he also heals. But even if Xilonen gives slightly more buffs theoretically, I think there's a good chance, at least in terms of usage, people will prefer sticking with someone like Zhongli. And besides, even if you can play Neuvillette fine without a shield, like me with my account, he's only C0. There's also offensive teammates like Xilonen, but you might find Xilonen clunky to use, fair enough. But there's also another thing I have about Neuvillette. By the way, before I forget, Kachina is also really good for Neuvillette if you want a non-clunky teammate. But yeah, the thing with Neuvillette is, even if you want a DPS upgrade, is it likely Xilonen will be stronger than just pulling Neuvillette C1 or even C2 or C3? Like a C1 giving another stack usually ends up more than like 25% damage increase, and you get this infinite hyper armor here as well. Or going from like a 4-star weapon like Prototype Amber to a signature weapon can be even close to 40% of an upgrade. Let's be honest, I doubt Xilonen will match that. But it's not even that. What about C1 on Farina? This is a big damage boost and it's front loaded. Will Xilonen match that? See, that's the thing about most newer DPSs that I've noticed. Their weapons and early constellations are so strong. I was actually planning on making a video on this topic actually, but if you really care about your damage or if you're pulling for damage, it's been hard to justify getting a 5-star support when the DPS's vertical investment is just so good. Yeah, sure, maybe in calculation theory crafting, where everything is stuck at C0 and 4-star weapons, you can think of this hypothetical scenario where Xilonen is a massive upgrade, but everyone has their own account. For your account and everyone's account, vertical investment is on the table. It's a real thing. So let me ask you this. If Xilonen does end up a weaker upgrade than getting Neuvillette C1, and the only real comeback you could give is that you don't want a C1, you want to invest horizontally and pull more characters. If that's your only real answer, then you kind of just have to accept that that's just your personal account preference, but those personal limitations are not an objective fact on what is an upgrade or not. And this is coming from someone who I myself don't like getting much constellations either, but I know that that's just my preference rather than what's actually optimal. Let's talk about Raiden as well. So when I talked about this Xilonen stuff on stream, a lot of people were unsure about why I've been hyping up Chevreuse replacing Kazuha for Raiden, also Cloran teams, and I hype up Chevreuse, but I'm having concerns about Xilonen. The thing is, why I think Chevreuse works amazingly with these electro DPSs is very specific. I've honestly always thought Chevreuse was super optimized to work well with Raiden, and if you're interested, I actually talked about this in my Chevreuse video a few weeks ago. To summarize it, there's basically 3 main factors that I think of. Number 1 is opportunity cost, which is that electro teams don't have as much to lose by being forced to play an overload team compared to what a pyro DPS has to lose. Like if you're playing Hu Tao, Arlecchino, Lini. With Raiden hyper teams, you're mostly just caring about raw damage, in which case Chevreuse just brings more buffs than Kazuha. But in comparison with a pyro DPS, to play overload, you have to lose something like Vape, you have to lose grouping when a character like Arlecchino and Lini can be freely swapped in and out to benefit from that grouping. Lini, especially with grouping, has AoE nukes, but without grouping, he feels like a single target DPS. Also VV on your grouping character. If you can switch out those pyro characters in and out, it's not hard to reapply debuffs and keep those debuffs relevant. There's also shields that you have to sacrifice in an overload team, unless you want to be forced to play someone like Toma or Beidou. They don't really compare to Zhongli though. Another aspect which I just touched on, which is that you can't switch out of Raiden or Clorand These characters lose their infusion when you switch them out. They have low uptime, and Raiden especially with her huge downtime, and this makes Kazuha's grouping less effective. You basically only get grouping at the start of your rotation, something like that, and this makes Kazuha's grouping less effective. But Raiden doesn't need that much grouping at the start because her burst has massive AoE and her charge attacks have good AoE too. Someone like Cloran does benefit from Kazuha's grouping a lot, but as you know, Cloran has this issue with her uptime, and since she suffers from not being able to switch out without making the uptime even more worse than it normally is, she ends up equally benefiting from Chevreuse's perma buffs and debuffs. Lastly, if you were thinking about adding Xilonen into Raiden teams to replace Chevreuse, then I have extreme doubts that would be an upgrade. There are tons of comparisons like energy, field time, buff comparisons, but let's be honest, you can't expect a more universal character like Xilonen to compete with Chevreuse at the role Chevreuse was specifically designed to do. You might even think about replacing the whole team, playing something like a double Hydro team. But yeah, anyone that's played Jean in this team, trying to buff with both Hydro and Electro swirls in a team like this, yeah, I can't imagine that's going to be any more realistic with Xilonen trying to get both Hydro and Electro crystallizes. We can also talk about Quicken teams. Quicken teams like Clorand or Yaimiko or Kuching. Now these can be teams where you could be comparing Xilonen and Kazuha, but it's honestly almost impossible for me to imagine Xilonen improving these. First of all, optimal Quicken teams, something like this, are generally harder to play for the average player considering a lack of healers and shielders. So as we know, comfort wise, at least in terms of usage, the average player is using someone like Zhongli for the shield. By the way, she won't even be able to buff the Dendro focused Quicken teams like Tainari or Al-Haytham, since obviously Dendro doesn't react with Geo, but that's another story. And damage wise, at least in these teams, it's not just about Kazuha's buffs, but it's also about his grouping and personal damage, which his personal damage is most relevant in Quicken teams. Characters like Cloran, Yaimiko, Fischl, Kuching, they really benefit from Kazuha's unmatched grouping and him being able to basically spam his grouping off cooldown. And yeah, because of his high EM and his electro absorption with his skill and burst, he genuinely does pretty good sub DPS damage in Quicken teams. Even if, like, generally speaking, Xilonen was balanced to be competitive in other teams support wise, utility wise with Kazuha, with these Quicken teams where Kazuha actually does relevant damage, it's hard to imagine Xilonen is also balanced to match Kazuha's damage potential. So overall, I don't see her thriving in Quicken teams either, especially because if you do need defensive utility, you can even do something like Kirara like this, and Kirara was free. Although to give her credit, I guess people could play Xilonen for her healing in a team like this maybe, but I don't think, at least DPS wise, it's going to be competitive. And also, let's talk about Vape teams. I think there's always been this unintentional thing in Genshin, which I don't know if the developers anticipated this, but it's how Kazuha absorbs Bennett's pyro whenever Kazuha is under the burst, and how that would be the key in double buffing in Vape teams. If you don't know what I'm talking about, let me just show you quickly. So how you can keep Hydro on an enemy, set up Bennett's burst, and then you can easily double swirl with Kazuha. That interaction allows Kazuha Bennett teams to work well where other teammates can't work as effectively. We've all tried it. The point is, Xilonen's buffs, at least the scroll set, because the equipment character needs to do reactions, Xilonen still needs to do similar interactions to what we've been trying to do with other non-Kazuha characters. I believe she still needs to generate both Hydro and Pyro crystallized shards to get her full buffs. And like we're saying, a lot of characters who aren't Kazuha can actually struggle with multi-buffing like this. If you want a good comparison, it's kind of like if you've ever tried to use Archaic Petra Zhongli to buff Ganyu in Ganyu Melt. It's just not a good time. And what's the likelihood another Geo would be? Yeah, sure, you probably can get her res shred, but you might not be able to get her full package. Lastly, and this is potentially the biggest killer in terms of concerns, as we know, the scroll set is insanely strong. It's kind of cheesy actually. It basically can make any Natlan character a support with big buffs, big 40% damage buffs. And Xilonen has the res shred in her base kit plus this huge damage buff when using the scroll set. This is why people have been drawing comparisons to Zhongli or Kazuha, who also provide buffs and provide res shred. But the thing is, this set doesn't stack. Now what if this highly anticipated Pyro Archon, who is also a Natlan character, might lose this set? Say for example, if she replaces Xiangling in a team like this, well then Xilonen is losing half her value. And a lot of team ideas that we've talked about could appreciate a Natlan Xiangling or other teammates who could be replaced in the future with a Natlan version. And if Xilonen is not guaranteed to be a huge upgrade, including the scroll set, and then in the future if you remove the scroll set, then that might be something you might end up regretting. Obviously this concern is just speculation, but I think it's very relevant to at least consider. Now let's get into a bit more positives. I have been thinking about it, and I think Mualani teams seem like the teams where I'm most confident Xilonen will be a consistent upgrade, and that's because of two main reasons. Number one, I've always found it tough to slot in an ideal healer or shielder into Mualani teams whilst keeping a good amount of team buffs. Like if you want maximum buffs in your team, you usually have to play some sort of shieldless team. Maybe something like this or something like this. And if you want to play Farina, then you have to slot in a less effective buffer like Baiju. And Xilonen should be ideal here. Mualani also has issues finding teammates with long-lasting buffs, like Kazuha's buffs expiring very quickly. And that's something Xilonen can definitely help with. And so I'll be very happy to pull Xilonen to buff my Mualani. However, I still do have a few concerns, and you might not care about these ones, but these are factors that might make Xilonen not perfect for Mualani. And the main one is just that how godly these current teams are at setting up quick. This is an example at the moment. It's not easy to play, but the setup time is godly. You can basically get 3-second setup times here, and by comparison, Xilonen with 5-star burst animations, you're probably taking almost 3 seconds on just her, let alone the rest of your team. That means if you're someone who cares about speed, your old team might have already killed the enemy before your Xilonen team has even finished setting up. The other issue is similar to my Neuvillette issue, which is that so far Mualani's vertical investment has just been proven to be broken. I have C0, there's people who have C1 and they just completely gap me in terms of damage, let alone if you have her C2. And these upgrades have just been proven to be way ahead of any 5-star support. A team like this with just 4-star teammates has been absolutely ridiculous. Even with just C1 or C2 Mualani, it just feels like a complete whale team. And not only the C1 and C2, I guess if you're whaling, you can just keep going further. And this is kind of just how a lot of hyper carry DPSs, the new DPSs are like. And it can just be hard to take smaller support upgrade comparisons too serious when investing in your DPS is just simply more DPS. Now, having said all this, here is where I could see her being more stronger than I'm saying. And as we know, you can't compare 1.0 characters in gear compared to 5.0 characters in gear. And it's likely she will have cracked constellations, maybe a cracked signature weapon. So if you're someone who wants to invest in that, then yeah, sure, that could be a different conversation. But then again, like I said, the vertical investment in your DPS could also be a factor. But anyway, that is still an upside for her. And another upside, and I know people are gonna mention it in the comments, but some people don't care about vertical investment and you'd rather keep pulling new characters. And yeah, of course, I always advocate pulling for whatever you like, pulling for what you want, but you have to understand that angle is just a completely different argument than if you want to talk about DPS, and that was what most of this video was about. Anyway, those are just my first impressions. Again, I'm just speculating here based off of the reveal. I could be right or wrong. I just wanted to get this first impressions out because I think there's a good chance I could be right. And I thought with a lot of hype going on, it might be important for some of you guys to hear that. But again, I do think she is going to be strong. It's just that I think it's unlikely she's like, oh my god, power creep, buffs to dozens of teams one of the best characters in the game. I think that level of hype could backfire. Anyway, the most important thing is just to wait until the character actually releases, and then everybody can test for themselves. Just be cautious of hype, that's all I'm saying. And yeah, thanks for watching.